and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The rampant COVID-19 pandemic has become a serious challenge for all countries in the world, and global cooperation has become more urgent need for all. Chinese State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Monday proposed a people-centric human rights philosophy in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic during a meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. He also called for promoting human rights via dialogue and cooperation and highlighted the importance of combining the universal principles of human rights with the reality in different countries. Wang Yi's remarks came as populism and counter-globalization are on the rise. Senior Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi also published an article saying multilateralism is the right choice. He said faced with global challenges such as the pandemic, economic recession, and climate change, no country can do it alone. Solidarity and cooperation are the most powerful weapons, quote unquote. But how are we going to achieve a more open, inclusive, and balanced and win-win global cooperation? Will multilateralism, in real sense, help us to get there? Let's loop in our panelists, who are very resourceful in sharing their stream of thoughts. For more on the latest debate about multilateralism and many other issues related to it, we're joined in Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from the Asia Research Institute of National University of Singapore. In Boston, Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. Last but not least, in Beijing, Fu Jun, Academic Dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Help me to understand what is multilateralism we're talking about today. Professor Mahbubani, could you start by giving us some advice?
Yes, I'm happy to start because one of the privileges in my life is that I serve as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations for over 10 years. And so, I lived and swam in multilateralism for 10 years of my life. And multilateralism is a big word and people don't understand what it means, but it's something very simple. Our world, as Kofi Annan said, the late Secretary General of the UN, has become a global village. We are all interlinked and interdependent. That's what climate change is telling us. That's what COVID-19 is telling us. So when you become a global village, you need a global village council. And that's what the United Nations is, and that's what multilateralism is about. Multilateralism is about strengthening our global village council, which is the United Nations and other such institutions.
However, I have to say there is indication that ideologies are becoming the defining factor in the basic principle of certain multilateralism. Are you afraid that would happen in the near future?
And this is very important. The answer to greater global divisions is to strengthen multilateral institutions. And therefore, we must always remember that even though there are 1.4 billion people in China, 330 million in the United States of America, that still leaves about 6 billion people in the rest of the world. We must listen to the voices of the 6 billion on this US-China geopolitical contest. Let's come together to fight global warming and set aside our ideological differences.
Right.
That's what you hear from 6 billion people.
Mr. Walsh, how do you see the possibility that the multilateralism we're talking about these days have been, in a way, shaped into selective multilateralism compared to what we believe in, as Professor Mahbubani said, global village?
Most of the big problems in the world today cannot begin to be addressed unless there are cooperation, at least among the great powers at a minimum, and preferably with sovereign countries around the world. And the opposite of multilateralism and global approaches is nationalism, where every country gives the most important emphasis to itself in competition with others. Now, the truth is, our current international system is based on countries, on governments, on sovereign states. It's not based on international institutions. What we've done is, after coming out of World War II, when things went really, really badly, because nationalism in Japan and Germany went completely, off the charts and millions of people were killed, the response to that was to say, hey, we can't let nationalism ruin us again, take us to the brink. We have to build cooperative structures and cooperate on the big problems. And it's worked for 70 years. But I think it's pretty clear that right now, in individual countries, in Europe, in the US, and in elsewhere, it is under challenge.
And yet, there has not been that strong a wind against multilateralism until recently, when some say the United States has realized it is not benefiting the most from the current international mechanism, including the multilateralism we have been talking about. That then become a starting point of the narrative change, even in a conversation like ours. So, Jim, I wonder whether that has some truth in it.
I have to say, I've seen nationalism over the decades arise in every country. Why? It's a human phenomenon. It's not limited to particular geography or set of borders. So I fear nationalisms rise in Europe, in Brazil, in East Asia. And I think it's it is the ideology of grievance. And so when things are tough, people blame other people rather than, accepting the, blame or, dealing with the reality. And it's easy to blame other countries for your problems. And that is true, unfortunately, for every country. So I think I'm in favor of battling nationalism everywhere, because it's always there bubbling below the surface, waiting to leap out. And we've seen the consequences of it. And we've seen it boil up in more countries recently. But I think it's a generic human phenomenon, not limited to any one place.
Okay. Professor Fu, please come in and join this conversation. I know you have your own perspective.
My friend Kishore used the word contradiction. I would prefer to use the word tensions. There are tensions between plural numbers and singular numbers. Even when you start from two parts, then you try to discover commonalities.
What is the priority from your perspective? Let's just say G7, G20, United Nations. You see the members that involved in these different organizations are very different, from small to absolutely gigantic. So what should be prioritized?
My word is at least we see, without referring to any country, unilateralism, bilateralism, then plurilateralism, then multilateralism. For me to project forward, the world will turn towards plurilateralism rather than multilateralism for the conceivable future.
Professor Mahbubani, you want to jump in? I saw you were trying to say.
And you asked the question, what is more important, G7, G20, the United Nations? That's a very, very good question. And I use it very simply. The G7 is a sunset organization. It represents the past. G20 is a sunrise organization because it represents the future, because it includes participants like China, like India, like the African countries. And so G20 is much more representative. So the G7 was a good representative of the Cold War era, where it represented one side in the Cold War. That world is gone, finished. The G20 represents the world of tomorrow because you have a multiplicity of actors. But the G20 can also work with the United Nations. And for example, I'll give you a simple, concrete example. When you had the Paris Climate Accord that succeeded, it was first negotiated privately among the G20, and then the G20 agreed, and the G20 said, okay, now we must get the whole world to endorse it, and that's how you had the Paris Accords. Okay. So these are basically building blocks. There may be, and Fujun is right, there are tensions, but the tensions can be resolved.
Mr. Walsh, during the Cold War, it was very much defined by two polars as ideological. Now, are we going back to that period of time?
So we've been talking about multilateralism, which often comes up in the context of solving a problem. And the truth is, we've had sort of a mix of different things going on for a long time, so that we've had national governments operating along multilateral arrangements, coexisted with the nation state, and then stuff that was happening at the international level, like Paris Peace Accords, where everyone participates together. And that mix is going to continue. Going forward, we will see nation states acting on their own. We'll see collaboration around particular problems, and the international institutions are not going to disappear, regardless of whether it becomes a bipolar world. But the question is, these three things are going to coexist together: individual states, some of them collaborating together, sometimes all of them collaborating together, but the mix is changing. And I don't think, I'm a firm believer in international cooperation, but I have doubts about where we are right now. And I have concerns. You see it in the survey data about citizens in all countries being less interested in cooperation and harboring ill feelings towards countries that are their neighbors. And that undermines the ability to cooperate. But, you know, as has been pointed out, we have some big problems, and they may force us to cooperate, whether we like it or not. But often politics is the big obstacle, even when the problems are important.
We heard the Chinese foreign minister recently have been talking about, vaccines that China has been contributing to the rest of the world. This is what he said: vaccines are related to people's rights of health and survival and development, adding that these rights are especially a priority amid the pandemic. He said China is the first country to make a commitment to making its COVID-19 vaccines global public goods. And he also said that vaccines should be distributed fairly around the world to ensure accessibility, affordability, especially in developing countries. Well, that's what China's officials said. But there is a big problem. If you look at the vaccines today, it is not carried out about multilateralism. It is not carried out in a way that, at least with the basic understanding of, if you don't save all, you don't save yourself either. Professor Mahbubani.
Clearly, when you're a leader of a country, and I would say, let's take France as an example. The most eloquent spokesman in favor of multilateralism is President Macron of France. And in fact, just yesterday, President Macron of France gave an interview where he said, hey, we must provide vaccines to the poor countries. But at the same time, leaders have to be realistic. They also want to protect the vaccines for their own population. So there's a tension between taking care of your own population and taking care of your own house and taking care of the global village. But there is a solution, and the solution is basically a certain degree of cooperation where you provide some amount of vaccines also to the rest of the village, but you're doing so for selfish reasons. Because unless everyone in your village gets vaccinated, you will get a problem again. So it is in your selfish interest to provide vaccines to the rest of the village. And here I must say, frankly, if you want one leading indicator of how the world is going to look like from 5 to 10 years from now, look at which countries are providing more vaccines to the poor countries. So the answer to your question, Tianwei, is look at the data. Which countries are providing more medicines? And that will give you an indication of what the world will be like. And therefore, we've got to not just look at politics, we've got to look at data also.
Mr. Walsh, what are some of your ideas, based on this interesting example of vaccines or some of the other commonly talked topics, that we could see through the real nature now of multilateralism and our ideal multilateralism?
Well, I think the past 70 years has given us example after example after example where multilateralism and globalism did work. One of the most obvious was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which reversed the spread of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Some would argue it's the biggest public policy success of the 20th century. But there are all sorts of things, taking care of, reducing malaria and certain diseases of the past where there was international cooperation has produced good outcomes. But the example you cite, COVID, sort of points to the problem, right? Because it's clearly, yes, there is a logic. Unless we're all protected, we're all vulnerable. And yet, despite that logic, we still get countries behaving in ways that are more nationalist. I support a system where we have greater access to poor countries and to all the citizens of the world. And the issue isn't so much whether we can design institutions to do it. What we really need to be able to do, which we didn't do for 70 years, is make the case to citizens that they benefited greatly from this, and this is a big deal. No one ever made that case. And then now in recent years, the success is invisible. And so people, when they have grievances, start to blame international institutions. Let's bet ourselves, then they'll adopt attitudes, and their leaders will not be able to cooperate because their domestic audience will prevent them and will reward leaders who do not favor cooperation. So job one for me is making a better case to people around the world about why this is so important and how unbelievably successful it has been.
Let me throw in a last point about human rights. This goes back to the original point. I've tried to draw more answers from all of you. That is whether some of the grand ideas and ideals that we have for our human society have become footballs of politics among countries. And therefore, it has lost its utmost sacred meaning, become a tool of tensions, a tool of conflicts. Could you help us to understand that? And this has a lot to do with the multilateralism that we are talking about today. Professor Mahbubani, I go to you first.
Well, I want to emphasize that I'm a great supporter and believer in human rights. And I think human rights has advanced the human condition dramatically. Anyway, so we don't have slavery, we don't have torture. All these are great improvements in the human condition. But at the same time, when I was ambassador to the UN in 1998, on the 50th anniversary, when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a group of former statesmen, important statesmen like Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, they proposed that in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we should have a Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities. And unfortunately, the UN failed to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities. But what COVID-19 has taught us is that we need to have rights and we need to have responsibilities. So for example, when you say I should have a freedom not to wear a mask in COVID-19, then I would respond, but you have a responsibility to wear a mask to protect your fellow citizen. So you cannot just speak about rights, you must also speak about responsibility. So you can say, oh, I must have a freedom not to take the vaccine, but you also have a responsibility to take the vaccine to protect your community. So for every right that we have, we must also talk about responsibilities. And that's what I think the big message from COVID-19, look, support human rights and support human responsibilities.
Yeah. Professor Fu, this is an interesting link. Human rights is more about individual or groups' rights, and yet multilateralism is mainly about things happening among countries. And now we see there are interlinks between these two concepts more frequently in some of the latest debate.
To begin with the two dimensions, even when I look at individuals, now English, even Keyshaw used the human rights, you see, it's a plural forms. The rights in the realm of physical stuff, okay? The wealth that we should have, and also the spiritual part, okay? Then with the combination, which one goes first? The physical part or the spiritual part? Or simultaneously? I would hope it's simultaneously, but the reality of the world is that sometimes you cannot do that. Now, I can be very frank, To China, it so happens when you look at the past 40 years, we have achieved so much in human rights, okay? But the recipe is so, it seems to me, is the physical dimension goes first, okay? Then hopefully the spiritual dimension will follow, okay? Give China a chance, we'll be there. And if I cite the Western ideology, okay, Maslow's pyramid of goals, it's a pyramid, 5 floors. The first floor is very physical, okay? Then the top one, self-actualization, very spiritual, okay? So do not get wrong. Human rights, yes. And for us to realize the ultimate goal, it's a process. And we need to have different strategies in a way.
I want to have this quote coming from Chinese Foreign Minister because it, in a way, helps us to understand what you have just said a little bit further. He said China supports all countries in strengthening exchanges and cooperation on human rights based on the principle of mutual respect, but opposed any attempt to attack and smear other countries or interference in other countries' internal affairs under the pretext of human rights. Now, that is a familiar tone coming from the Chinese side. But now take a closer look at it, Mr. Walsh. In the grand discussion on multilateralism we have been just talking about, will human rights become an important component helping us to form real multilateralism, or will human rights, as the Chinese side suspected, be used as a tool to separate us by some?
Now, are countries going to use human rights as a way to criticize other countries because they have other political problems? Of course they are. They have in the past, they will in the future. That's the way it is. But that's just the normal state of politics. There was no golden age in the past where everyone observed human rights and everything was great. So this is a work in progress. But the thing that is so interesting about it, particularly for this conversation, is that human rights are rooted in the individual, and at least according to the UN Declaration, endorsed by all the countries of the world, they are universal. So that's a very different thing. That's the opposite of nationalism. That means that no matter where you live, you're entitled to be treated with a certain minimum amount of dignity and respect. And I think that's very powerful. Now, how that's going to play out, every country has its own problems, and some are going to be good at this and some are going to be bad. But we should talk about it and we should argue about it because, as you say, it is fundamentally important. And it's one of the few subjects in all the policy debates that you and I might talk about, where all the countries of the world have agreed and set universal values regardless of where you live. And that gives us reason to believe that multilateralism will continue to be important, because the only way to resolve these very sticky issues, the balance between intervening in internal affairs and human rights, that tension, to use the word that was used before, it'll be multilateral and other approaches that are going to get us through to a better place, I think.